The Bofors 40mm gun, often referred to simply as the Bofors gun, is an anti-aircraft, multi-purpose autocannon designed in the 1930s by the Swedish arms manufacturer AB Bofors. It was one of the most popular medium-weight anti-aircraft systems during World War II, used by most of the Western Allies as well as by the Axis powers. A small number of these weapons remain in service to this day, and saw action as late as the Gulf War. In the post-war era, the original design was not suitable for action against jet-powered aircraft, so Bofors introduced a new model of significantly more power, the 40mm L-70. In spite of sharing almost nothing with the original design other than the caliber and the distinctive conical flash hider, this weapon is also widely known simply as the Bofors. Although not as popular as the original L-60 model, the L-70 remains in service to this day, especially as a multi-purpose weapon for light armored vehicles, as on the CV-90. Bofors itself has been part of BAE Systems AB since March 2005. Development. The Swedish Navy purchased a number of 2-pounder pom-poms from Vickers as anti-aircraft guns in 1922. The Navy approached Bofors about the development of a more capable replacement. Bofors signed a contract in late 1928. Bofors produced a gun that was a smaller version of a 57mm semi-automatic gun developed as an anti-torpedo boat weapon in the late 19th century by Finspång. The first test gun was a rebarreled Nordenfeldt version of the Finspång gun, to which was added a semi-automatic loading mechanism. Testing of this gun in 1929 demonstrated that the problem existed feeding the weapon in order to maintain a reasonable rate of fire, a mechanism that was strong enough to handle the stresses of moving the large round was too heavy to move quickly enough to fire rapidly. One attempt to solve this problem used zinc shell cases that burned up when fired. This proved to leave heavy zinc deposits in the barrel, and had to be abandoned. In the summer of 1930 experiments were made with a new test gun that did away with controlled feed and instead flicked the spent casing at the rear, whereafter a second mechanism reloaded the gun by throwing a fresh round from the magazine into the open breech. This seemed to be the solution they needed, improving firing rates to an acceptable level, and the work on a prototype commenced soon after. During this period, Krupp purchased a 1/3 share of Bofors. Krupp engineers started the process of updating the Bofors factories to use modern equipment and metallurgy, but the 40mm project was kept secret. The prototype was completed and fired in November 1931, and by the middle of the month it was firing strings of 2 and 3 rounds. Changes to the feed mechanism were all that remained, and by the end of the year it was operating at 130 rounds per minute. Continued development was needed to turn it into a weapon suitable for production, which was completed in October 1933. Since acceptance trials had been passed the year before, this became known as the 40mm Arkan M32. Most forces referred to it as the Bofors 40mm L-60, although the barrel was actually 56.25 calibers in length, not the 60 calibers that the name implies. The gun fired a 900 grams high explosive 40 × 311 shell at 2,960 feet per second. The rate of fire was normally about 120 rounds per minute, which improved slightly when the barrels were closer to the horizontal as gravity assisted the feeding from the top-mounted magazine. In practice, firing rates were closer to 80 to 100 revolutions per minute, as the rounds were fed into the breech from 4-round clips which had to be replaced by hand. The maximum attainable ceiling was 7,000 3,200 meters, but the practical maximum was about 3,800 meters. The gun was provided with an advanced sighting system. The trainer and layer were both provided with reflector sights for aiming, while a third crew member standing behind them adjusted for lead using a simple mechanical computer. Power for the sights was supplied from a 6-volt battery. In spite of the successful development, the Swedish Navy changed its mind and decided it needed a smaller hand-swung weapon of 13 mm to 25 mm size, and tested various designs from foreign suppliers. With the 40 mm well along in development, Bofors offered a 25 mm version in 1932, which was eventually selected as the 25 mm Archon M32. The first version of the 40 mm the Navy ordered was intended for use on submarines, where the larger caliber allowed the gun to be used for both AA and against smaller ships. The barrel was shorter at 42 calibers long, with the effect of reducing the muzzle velocity to about 700 meters per second. When not in use, the gun was pointed directly up and retracted into a watertight cylinder. The only known submarines that used this arrangement was the Hornet-class boats. The guns were later removed as the subs were modified with streamlined conning towers. The first order for the real L-60 was made by the Dutch Navy, who ordered 5 twin-gun mounts for the Kreuzer de Ruyter in August 1934. These guns were stabilized using the Hayes-Meyer mount, in which one set of layers aimed the gun, while a second manually stabilized the platform the gun sat on. All 5 mounts were operated by one fire control system. Bofors also developed a towable carriage which they displayed in April 1935 at a show in Belgium. This mount allowed the gun to be fired from the carriage with no setup required, although with limited accuracy. If time was available for setup, the gunners used the towbar and muzzle lock as levers, raising the wheels off the ground and thereby lowering the gun onto supporting pads. 2 additional legs folded out to the sides, and the platform was then leveled with hand cranks. The entire setup process could be completed in under a minute. Orders for the land-based versions were immediate, starting with an order for 8 weapons from Belgium in August 1935, and followed by a flood of orders from other forces including Poland, Norway, and Finland. It was accepted into the Swedish Army the next year, known as the 40 mm Vaken M36, the lowercase m indicating an Army model as opposed to the capital M for Navy. Because of the labor shortages, some of the Bofors 40 mm factories were opened in Poland. The Swedish Navy adopted the weapon as the M36 in hand-worked single air-cooled and power-operated twin water-cooled version. A twin air-cooled mounting, probably handwork, was also used by the navies of Sweden and Argentina, and a twin air-cooled wet mounting was developed for Polish submarines. British versions. Army and RAF Regiment versions. The British Army had first examined the weapon when they received a number of Polish-built examples in 1937 for testing. Known as the QF 40 mm Mark I or Mark I-II, after a minor change to the flash hider, a license was acquired and the gun was converted from metric to imperial measurements. They also made numerous changes to the design to make it more suitable for mass production, as the original Bofors design was intended to be hand-assembled, and many parts were labeled "file to fit on assembly," requiring many man-hours of work to complete. Testing showed that aiming the guns against high-speed aircraft was a serious problem. Although the gun could be trained quickly, aiming accurately while doing so proved difficult. In order to address this, the British introduced a complex mechanical analog computer, the Kerosene Director, which drove the laying electrically. A three-man team operated the director simply by pointing it at the target whilst dialing in estimates for range and various atmospheric conditions. The director then aimed the guns directly through powered mounts. As the gunners loaded the clips, backup sights were fitted to the individual guns, replacing the former reflector sight and lead calculator with a ring and post sight known as a pancake. In this form, the QF-40mm Mark III became the Army's standard light AA weapon, operating alongside the 3-inch and 3.7-inch heavy weapons. The gun was considered so important to the defense of England after the fall of France in 1940 that a movie, The Gun, was produced to encourage machinists to work harder and complete more of them. By the end of the war, total production from British, Canadian, and Australian factories was over 2,100, while U.S. Lend-Lease examples added about 150. In combat, it was found that the kerosene was difficult to set up to use in many situations, as well as making logistics more complex due to the need to keep its electrical generator supplied with fuel. In most engagements, only the pancake sights were used, without any form of correction, making the British versions less capable than those used by other forces. Eventually, an anti-aircraft gunnery school on the range at Stiffkey on the Norfolk coast delivered a workable solution, a trapeze-like arrangement that moved the pancake sights to offer lead correction, operated by a new crew member standing behind the left-hand layer. The Stiffkey sight was sent out to units in 1943, arriving in Canadian units in the midst of the Battle of the Aleutian Islands. A final wartime change to the elevation mechanism resulted in the QF-40mm Mark XII. They also designed a much lighter two-wheeled carriage for airborne use. The Army also experimented with various self-propelled anti-aircraft systems based on various tank chassis. Changes to the breech for this role created the QF-40mm Mark VI, which was used on the Crusader to produce the Crusader 3 AA Mark I. The main self-propelled version of the Bofors used the gun set on the chassis of a Morris commercial four-wheel drive lorry. This was known as the Carrier SP 4x4 40mm AA 30 hundredweight. Such guns were used in support of Army divisions to provide swift protection against air attack without the need to unlimber. They saw service in Northwest Europe, where 6 SP Bofors of 92nd Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, Royal Artillery, landed with the British 3rd Infantry Division on Sword Beach on D-Day to protect the vital bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River, shooting down 17 German planes. Later in the campaign, SP Bofors were used extensively for ground shoots as well as in an anti-aircraft role. In British Army service, the Bofors found a highly specialised role. During the North Africa campaign at the Second Battle of El Alamein, they were used to fire tracer horizontally to mark safe paths for units through the German minefields. This practice was further developed during operations in Northwest Europe, where bursts of color-coded tracer were used to define the axis of advance of the different formations in large-scale night attacks. The formation of the Raf Regiment in February 1942 signaled the transfer of responsibility for defending airfields to the RAF from the Army. This included low-level air defense, and a Bofors L-60 to the same design as the Army version was the principal weapon for the RAF regiments. Light anti-aircraft squadrons in North Africa, Malta, Italy, the Balkans, the UK, and northwestern Europe Number 2875 Squadron Raf Regiment, employing the L-60, became the first unit to shoot down a jet aircraft, a Me-262, with ground-based anti-aircraft fire, at Helmond in the Netherlands on 28 November 1944. Although the Allied air forces had achieved air superiority after D-Day, forward airfields continued to be high-priority targets for the Luftwaffe when the opportunity presented, and this ensured that the RAF regiments, L-60s, continued to be heavily used. For example, during the Ardennes offensive, RAF regiment light anti-aircraft squadrons shot down 43 German aircraft and damaged 28 others during attacks on 11 RAF forward airfields on New Year's Day 1945. After World War II, the RAF regiment continued to employ the L-60 as its principal anti-aircraft weapon until it was replaced by the L-70 gun in 1957. The guns were deployed in the UK, Germany, Cyprus, the Middle East, and the Far East. Naval versions. The Royal Navy also made extensive use of the Bofors. The first examples were air-cooled versions quickly adapted to ships during the withdrawal from Norway. With the fall of the West in 1940, the Dutch minelayer Willem van der Zon brought them the first example of a water-cooled gun on the Heesmeyer, triaxially stabilized mounting. Locally produced examples started arriving in 1942, known as the QF 40mm Mark IV for use in twin mounts, or the QF 40mm Mark V for single mounts. The Navy ran through a variety of versions of the basic Bofors gun over the war, including the Mark VII to Mark XI. The Royal Navy's homegrown light anti-aircraft weapon, the QF 2-pounder gun, also had a caliber of 40mm, but was referred to as the QF2PDR. The designation of models in Royal Navy service is confused, as the gun and its mounting received separate mark numbers. The following mountings were used: Mark I, twin mounting based on American design and using American-built guns, not widely fitted for remote fire control. Mark II, quadruple version similar to Mark I. Mark III, a navalized version of the Army single mounting, hand-worked elevation and training. Mark IV, a triaxially stabilized twin mounting copied from, and usually known as the Heesmeyer. It had on-mounting fire control, and was usually fitted with radar type 282 to provide target range information. Mark V, twin mounting, that superseded and eventually replaced the Mark IV, often referred to as the utility mounting. This was a simplified, unstabilized mounting based on the American twin mounting Mark I, and was designed for remote fire control. Mark VI, a 6-barreled weapon feeding from large trays instead of clips and designed for remote control from a dedicated radar-equipped director. Mark VII, a single-barreled, hydraulically powered mounting that superseded the Mark III and entered service in 1945. Mark IX, Mark VII mount modified to electrical power as the mounting Mark IX, and in this form saw service in the Falklands War. The mounting Mark V for the 20mm autocannon QF 2-pounder guns was also adopted initially as an interim mount for the Bofors. It was a single-barreled mounting with hydraulic power, and was known as the Boffin. The final British Bofors mounting that saw service was the SDAAG, which was twin-barreled, stabilized, and carried its own tachometric fire control system, based around the centimeter radar type 262, capable of locking onto a target. This mounting was heavy and the high vibration environment of the gun mounting was poor location for sensitive valve electronics and mechanical computers. SDAAG Mark I carried the radar dish over the gun barrels where it was subject to damage during firing. Therefore SDAAG Mark II shifted the set to the roof of the control cabin. SDAAG was ultimately too difficult to maintain in the harsh environment of a warship and was later replaced by the mounting Mark V with the fire control equipment located remotely, the single Mark VII, and ultimately with the Seacat missile. The final version of SDAAG was fitted to the RN Type 12 Whitby per-second frigates and the Type 41 61st diesel frigates completed 1956-8. HMNZS Royalist was also fitted with SDAAG Mk2 during modernization, completed in 1956. Initially it had 3 SDAAG CIWS. The SDAAG in Q position was removed in 1960, but it carried 2 mounts until the end of its service in Southeast Asian waters. In 1965, a crew of Royalist appeared to find the SDAAG a reasonably effective and impressive anti-aircraft weapon during Operation Musketeer in 1956. Off Egypt, U.S. versions, manufacturing, in order to supply both the Army and Navy with much greater numbers of the guns. Chrysler built 60,000 of the guns and 120,000 barrels through the war, at half the original projected cost, and filling the Army's needs by 1943. Over the lifetime of the production, their engineers introduced numerous additional changes to improve mass production, eventually reducing the overall time needed to build a gun by half. Most of these changes were in production methods rather than the design of the gun itself. There were many difficulties in producing the guns within the United States, beyond the complexity. The drawings were metric in Swedish and read from the first angle of projection, with lower precision than needed for mass production. Chrysler had to translate to English, fix absolute dimensions, and switch to the third angle of projection. Chrysler engineers also tried to simplify the gun, unsuccessfully, and to take high-speed movies to find possible improvements. But this was not possible until near the end of the war. Naval. The United States Navy's Bureau of Ordnance purchased a twin-mount air-cooled example, spare parts and 3,000 rounds of ammunition directly from Bofors, which arrived in New York on the 28th of August 1940 aboard the Army transport US-80 American Legion, which had evacuated 897 people, including members of the Norwegian royal family, through the Finnish port of Petsamo. During that month another Dutch ship, the Van Kinsbergen, demonstrated the Hayes-Meyer mount to Navy observers. The gun was quickly chosen as the Navy's standard anti-aircraft weapon, and the Navy secretly imported a set of imperial designs from England and started production illegally. A formal contract with Bofors followed in June 1941. The resulting Mark Chapter 1 and Mark Chapter 2 weapons were intended for the left and right side of a twin mount, respectively, and were adapted by Chrysler for water cooling. After the war, the .350 caliber gun Mark Chapter 27 mount began to replace the Bofors, because the VT proximity fuse would not fit a 40 mm projectile. The Navy's satisfaction with the weapons was demonstrated by the practice of telegraphing Chrysler Corporation with the serial numbers of guns when they shot down an aircraft. Army. The United States Army had recently introduced a 37 mm gun of their own design, but found it to be of limited performance. 6 British Bofors were imported for testing, along with the kerosene directors, and proved to be superior in all areas. In U.S. Army service, the single-mount Bofors was known as the 40mm automatic gun M1. The U.S. version of the gun fired 3 variants of the British Mk2 high-explosive shell as well as the M81A1 armor-piercing round, which was capable of penetrating some 50mm of homogeneous armor plate at a range of 500 yards. The dual version of the gun was mounted on an M24 Chaffee tank chassis and was called the M19 gun motor carriage. This practice would be continued, heavily modifying the M41 Walker Bulldog into the M42 Duster. Captured examples. The Wehrmacht used a number of Bofors guns which had been captured in Poland and France. The Kriegsmarine also operated some guns obtained from Norway. In German naval use, the gun was designated the 4 cm Flak 28, and was used aboard the cruisers Admiral Hipper and Prinz Eugen toward the end of the war. Beginning in 1942, several E-boats were equipped with the Flak 28 to enable them to fight against British MGBs and MTBs on equal terms. Japan captured a number of Bofors guns in Singapore and put them into production as the Type 5. Both Japan and West Germany continued to use the Bofors gun throughout the Cold War. The Federal German Navy used it in destroyers, frigates, and fast patrol boats until 1984, in minesweepers to the present day. Variants. Although the L-60 was later replaced in production by the L-70, the L-60 remained in frontline service well into the 1980s. In most cases, these were the ground anti-aircraft versions, as a suitable replacement in this role did not come along until the introduction of truly effective MANPADS missiles in the 1980s. In United States Army service, the M19 gun motor carriage was replaced by the M42 Duster, using the same turret but based on the chassis of the M41 Walker Bulldog tank. The L-60 saw active service with the Argentinian and British navies in the 1982 Falklands War and continued to be used into the 1990s, when it was replaced by modern 20mm and 30mm artillery. The Canadian forces also used Bofors on the surface fleet but removed the guns in the late 1980s when they were considered to be outdated. Bofors continue to be the main armament of the Kingston-class coastal defense vessel, although the Navy is in the midst of a search for a suitable replacement. As of August 2006, the French Navy uses L-60s on more than 20 ships. Ships of the Norwegian and Icelandic Coast Guards continue to use the 40mm Bofors gun. The L-60 continued in use in the Irish Army until recent years, when it was retired in favour of the radar-controlled L-70. The Irish Naval Service P-20 class retained L-60s on board as the main weapon until the 1990s but were rearmed with L-70s. The last remaining P-20 class patrol vessel, due for decommissioning in 2016, is now the only vessel fitted with the L-70. 2 retired L-60s can be seen adjacent the square in Sarsfield Barracks, Limerick. The last 40mm 60 Bofors in service with the Royal Australian Navy were used as the main weapon aboard the Fremantle-class patrol boats, and for training purposes at the West Head Gunnery Range at HMAS Cerberus. These were removed from service during 2007. Bofors were used aboard almost every round ship to operate between the 1940s and the 1990s. As of 20 2012, the L-60 is still in use by the military of Brazil, Paraguay and Taiwan. 40mm L-70 By the end of World War II, jet aircraft had so increased the speed of attack that the Bofors simply could not get enough rounds into the air to counter the aircraft before it had already flown out of range. In order to counter these threats, the gun would have to have longer range and a higher rate of fire, thereby increasing the number of rounds fired over the period of an engagement. Bofors considered either updating the 40mm or alternately making a much more powerful 57mm design, and in the end did both. The new 40mm design used a larger 40x364R round, firing a slightly lighter 870 grams shell at a much higher 1030 meters per second muzzle velocity. The rate of fire was increased to 240 rounds per minute, similar to the German Flak 43. Additionally, the carriage was modified to be power-laid, the power being supplied by a generator placed on the front of the carriage. The first version was produced in 1947, accepted in 1948 as the 40mm Vacan M48, and entered Swedish service in 1951. Additional changes over the years have improved the firing rate, first to 300 revolutions per minute, and later to 330 revolutions per minute. Foreign sales started, as they had in the past, with the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. In November 1953 it was accepted as the NATO standard anti-aircraft gun, and was soon produced in the thousands. The L-70 was also used as the basis for a number of SPAAGs, notably the U.S. Army's failed M247 Sergeant York. The UK's RAF Regiment adopted the L-70 to replace its L-60 guns in 1957, retiring its last examples in 1977 and replacing them with the Rapier system. In the Swedish Army Combat Vehicle 90 there is a cartridge-fed, automatic version of the L-70 gun installed. In order to fit inside the vehicle, the gun is mounted upside down. New armor-piercing and programmable ammunition have also been developed. Germany has used L-70 guns on its Class 352, Class 333 and Class 332 mine-hunting vessels, although these will be replaced by Rheinmetall MLG-27 remote-controlled gun systems until 2008. Until the early 80s, L-70 guns, guided by D-7B radars, were in widespread use in the anti-aircraft role in the German Navy and German Air Force until replaced by Roland SAMs. DARDO breeder of Italy uses Bofors 40mm L-70 gun in its anti-aircraft weapons systems Type 64, Type 106, Type 107, Type 564 and Type 520. Also, they have developed a CIWS system named DARDO for the Italian Army and Navy. A newer development from breeder, the Fast 40, has nearly doubled the rate of fire to 450 revolutions per minute. Normally equipped with a 736-round magazine and a dual-feed mechanism for naval use. Gunships since the beginning of the 1970s, Bofors L-60s have still used it in the United States Air Force's AC-130 gunships in the air-to-ground role. There were plans to remove these and the M61 Vulcans from newer AC-130U variants and replace them with 30mm autocannons. However, these plans did not come to fruition, and the Bofors and Vulcans are still in service. When 4 additional AC-130US were to be converted from 2002, the necessary 40mm L-60 guns had to be salvaged from old M42 targets at the Nellis AFB range. Users